Most of the trade speculation we've been seeing around the Orlando Magic since they got eliminated in round one by the Boston Celtics has been all about a ball handling and shooting point guard, guys like Trae Young, Jordan Poole, etc. But they went out and got more of a scorer in a guy like Desmond Bane. In this video, I'm going to talk about what this trade means for both teams on the floor as if I were coaching the Magic or coaching the Grizzlies. I'm going to talk about what kinds of looks it opens up for these teams, how it improves or worsens certain lineups, and what I would do schematically to really maximize these teams based on the new personnel they're bringing in and how they played last season. I'm not really going to be talking about the team building and the asset management parts of this trade, as it's not really my area of expertise, not really where I'm confident in my ability to speak. I'm more of an on-court and coaching guy, so that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Court Vision. And like I said, I'm going to be talking about this Desmond Bane trade. The full trade package, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's Orlando is receiving Desmond Bane, while Memphis Grizzlies are receiving Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Cole Anthony, this year's 16th overall pick, 3 future first-round picks, and a pick swap. So a pretty big haul for Desmond Bane for the Grizzlies. Without further ado, though, let's talk about it. First, I'm going to talk about the Orlando Magic. From a purely basketball perspective, not considering the assets given up, I love this trade. This team can still be a really solid elite defense. They don't lose much on that end of the floor, and this trade will massively improve their offense. I mean, there are theoretically better guys who maybe could have been even better for the offense and even better fit, but Desmond Bane should be pretty solid for this team. The first and most important thing is Desmond Bane is immediately going to improve the spacing for the Orlando Magic offense. Their spacing last year was really, really bad. They were towards the bottom of the league in three-point frequency and three-point percentage, and their lack of spacing has really been a consistent problem for both of their star players in Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner. Both of these guys want to work inside the arc and aren't super prolific shooters themselves, so having bad spacing around them has made their lives as ball handlers so much harder. And it's probably hampered their development as well to some extent. Desmond Bane coming in for KCP, he's a much better shooter than KCP has been this year. Bane is a career 41% three-point shooter and shot 39% from beyond the arc this year compared to KCP, who the Magic brought in at the beginning of last year to be an elite 3-and-D role player, but he only shot 34% this season. Just not a great spacing option this year, even if he has been a good shooter beyond just this season. Desmond Bane also helps with the spacing because he's much more capable as a threat beyond just catch and shoots. He's more of a movement shooter coming off screens. He's much better at putting the ball on the deck, attacking a closeout, and he's also an on-ball spacing threat with his ability to shoot off the dribble and take pull-ups, things like that. All of this stuff gives him more gravity and more aura as a spacer. Desmond Bane's skills as a movement shooter and as a ball handler in certain situations are also going to open up all kinds of different offensive looks in the half court, and it's also going to allow the Magic to inject a little more pace into their game as well. All throughout last season, Orlando really lacked a credible threat on 2 super important types of plays, and those are going to be off-screen shooting and pick and roll. And Desmond Bane can do both of those things to some extent, especially as a second option or a third option behind the scoring and ball handling of Paolo and Franz. Desmond Bane is an elite movement shooter coming off down screens, coming off handoffs, these types of plays. Having a guy like him on the floor who can lift for a 3 or something like that next to Paolo and Franz and their scoring gravity as wings really is going to improve the versatility and the complexity of Orlando's offense. And what I mean by that is they're going to have more different looks and more different options that they feel comfortable going to generate offense, either as a change of pace or against certain coverages. As a coach, this makes your job a lot easier because you just have more tools, more ideas, more options that you can go to offensively. Desmond Bane also can be a ball handler in certain moments, which was going to create opportunities offensively for the Magic. He's not traditionally known as a high-usage ball handler, but in my opinion, from what I've seen watching him play, I think he can be a pretty solidly effective pick-and-roll ball handler or handler in some other kinds of screen actions. Maybe play some two-man game with a wing like Franz or Paolo. Having him as a reasonably capable decision-maker and strong scorer in any kind of pick-and-roll with those wings or with a big man just makes those pick and roll looks for the Magic so much more potent than they were last season. Jalen Suggs or Cole Anthony oftentimes were the primary ball handlers in pick and roll situations a lot. And those guys, I mean, no disrespect to them. Cole Anthony's a solid player, and Jalen Suggs, in my opinion, is a really good player, but they just don't have the punch as scorers in those situations to make their pick and roll a really consistent go-to offensive look, if that makes sense. So bringing in Desmond Bane is going to give their pick and roll a lot more bite, even if he's not going to be the, playmaking point guard that the Magic have been looking for. Bane's threat as a pull-up shooter and being a guy who can bring the ball up the floor, as well as his spacing gravity that I talked about before, are going to open up opportunities to up the pace for this Magic team as well. That was another huge problem they had this year. They got caught up a lot in stagnant half-court possessions simply because their pace was so low. But having that extra space and more options in transition from a guy like Desmond Bane is going to allow you to get out and run a little more and just prevent yourself from falling into some of those ruts offensively. Something that this trade is kind of signaling to me from a philosophical point of view is that the Magic are really investing in and believing in internal improvements from Jalen Suggs, from Paolo, from Franz, and maybe from even Anthony Black as ball handlers, those guys. Like I said, Desmond Bane isn't going to be a point guard for this team, so there's clearly a belief from the organization and the coaching staff that the improvements that we've seen from Jalen Suggs as an initiator and from Paolo and Franz handling the ball will continue to, happen and will be enough to provide a level of offensive creation for this team. In their eyes, I feel like Suggs is going to continue to have opportunities as a lead ball handler for certain stretches. Franz will continue to be an initiator and playmaker off of his drives. Paolo will hopefully improve as a playmaker, and Anthony Black can maybe step into that bench point guard role that we saw Cole Anthony in last year. So all of those guys are going to have an easier time handling the ball, and not only just, handling the ball to begin with, but also developing and improving as ball handlers and playmakers with a guy like Desmond Bane on the floor next to them. The spacing he provides, the ability that he has to convert on looks that are generated for him, his ability to participate in actions with those guys is just going to make their lives easier and allow them to really develop and improve their own playmaking skills. The last thing I'm going to talk about for the Magic specifically is how having Bane on the team allows them to kind of try out and experiment with new offensive philosophies that we haven't seen from them before. And I'm going to talk about a couple that have been inspired kind of by other really good teams. So to give some context, after this trade, the Magic now have 4 players in the starting lineup who can, at least on paper, dribble, pass, and score the ball in some way. Jalen Suggs can be a ball handler and is a competent three-point shooter. Desmond Bane's a really good scorer on and off ball. Franz is a great downhill scorer and playmaker. Paolo's a really strong scorer and has tools to become a good playmaker as well, even if he hasn't necessarily done that super well thus far in his career. So they have these 4 guys who are all capable of being contributing pieces to an offensive system. But none of those guys necessarily, in my eyes, at least right now, are clearly, the number one option, clearly the high usage engine of the team. Paolo and Franz certainly have the potential to be that, but they have holes in their game that kind of prevent them from being, the number one guy on this team. So with that, I think there are a couple different philosophies they can try out to maybe work around that, not having the perfect number one guy. And the first one that I want to talk about is the kind of 2 starting lineup look inspired by what the Cavs have done this season. If Paolo and Franz continue to struggle to play together well and be effective in their minutes together, I think a look that could be interesting is splitting them up and having like the 2 starting lineup look similar to what Cleveland did this season with Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, and then Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen splitting minutes and kind of having those 2 separate lineups. Obviously, there's a problem with that, which the Magic just don't have the depth of shooters and role players around them to surround those pairings like Cleveland did, which makes the split lineups a little less threatening. But, some kind of minute split between these pairs of guards and the pair of wings can probably be effective to some extent, to keep the offensive production high for a full 48 minutes throughout the game. Another kind of philosophical shift we can maybe see is a sort of offense by committee drive and kick game inspired a little bit by what Boston has done over the last couple seasons. Boston's big superpower over the past few years has really been their ability to have 4 or 5 guys on the floor who can attack closeouts, who can pass out of their drives, who can get teams in rotation. The Magic don't have the shooting ability that Boston does. Obviously, Boston, has this drive and kick game to try and generate open 3-point looks, but they can still, kind of use that infrastructure, that kind of offensive style with, Franz, Paolo, Desmond Bane to get the defense in rotation and generate advantages, similarly to how the Celtics use Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and Derek White kind of as initiators off of their drives. The other thing I could see them doing is focusing more on a transition offense, but not quite like Houston and also not quite like Indiana, but somewhere in between those two teams. The Magic don't have that insane athleticism that like Houston does, nor do they have like the transition playmaking talent of Indiana, but they can definitely take some cues from both to try and improve their own transition attack. For Houston, they can definitely take inspiration from their offense from defense philosophy. Orlando's defense was elite before this trade and will probably continue to be elite after, so they can use their ability to get teams in the mud and slow them down, get stops, to move the other way after a stop with their downhill threats, kind of like Houston does. Franz especially, but also Paolo and now Desmond Bane are very capable at running the floor, making stuff happen in transition in their own unique ways. They can also take some inspiration from the Indiana Pacers and how they use their pace to kind of enable all 5 players that are on the floor. Franz is a fantastic playmaker and downhill scorer in transition. Desmond Bane is a great scorer all over the floor in transition. Their bigs are, fairly athletic, capable of running the floor, benefiting from that. And Paolo as well can attack cross matches generated, by pushing the pace, kind of how the Pacers use Pascal Siakam. So just using that pace to generate advantages for everyone on the floor. Switching gears now to the Memphis Grizzlies and how they feel after this trade. The overwhelming feeling that I'm really getting for them is that this is just the beginning for this offseason for them. If this trade means what I think it means, I think it's going to signal a continuing shift in philosophy from their coaching staff and front office to kind of invest more in Ja Morant as the leader of their offense and by building a defensive infrastructure, led by Jaren Jackson Jr. I wasn't going to talk about team building too much, but I feel it's pretty clear that this move was made to open up cap space to bring back Jaren Jackson. And then everything we've seen and heard from the organization makes it clear that they want to empower and build around Ja offensively moving forward. So those are really kind of what I think the 2 keys are for this team, is building a better defensive infrastructure around Jaren Jackson and then building an offense that works to empower Ja Morant. So after this trade, the first thing you can point to is KCP is going to immediately improve the Grizzlies' defense. The biggest defensive weakness for the Grizzlies this year, in my opinion, was kind of a lack of on-ball defenders and guys who can really navigate screens, stick them on highly active guards, and hold up in those matchups. Jalen Wells was good in that kind of role before his injury, and now bringing in KCP gives them like a real clear duo of defensive guys who can be trusted to stop opposing teams' guards, opposing teams' wings. So now that you have 2 ball stoppers with, DPOY level defense, roaming and help from Jaren Jackson, and some underrated rim protection from Zach Edey, there's the framework of a really solid defensive infrastructure there after a pretty underwhelming year defensively from Desmond Bane. So that's something to look forward to if you're a Grizzlies fan. But on the other hand, their offense is now going to rely on Ja Morant more than ever. Everything we've seen, all the reports and communication from the organization since they fired Taylor Jenkins at the end of the season, has all made it pretty clear that they want to build this offense around empowering Ja Morant. And this trade follows that pretty clearly with the on-court product as well. Moving on from Desmond Bane puts a lot more load on Ja Morant, and, because he's their next best scorer, and it centers the offense around Ja as well much more, because he's really the number 1 guy who can put the ball on the floor and create. The idea is that to maximize him as a superstar, they need to center him in the system, and trading Bane is a pretty massive step in that direction. Without Desmond Bane as a secondary pick and roll ball handler and a scoring threat, Ja is going to have much more opportunity to work as a driver and as a ball handler in pick and roll scenarios, paired with a guy like Zach Edey, who I think is going to have a bigger role in a more Ja-centric offense. He's gotten more minutes post Taylor Jenkins firing, and his ability to be a pick and roll partner for Ja is going to give him much more opportunity. We'll see more two-man game with Edey, and then just more, drive and kick generation from Ja Morant, which is going to maximize him as a scorer and playmaker at the expense of some of the scoring you lose with a guy like Desmond Bane leaving. I don't have anything really more to say about the Grizzlies because it's hard to say more until we see what other moves that they're going to make this offseason. It's hard to make concrete observations, concrete predictions beyond what I've already said for the Grizzlies because, it's clear they're not done with this offseason. They just got 4 first-round picks and a swap, as well as some cap space from this trade. I think they're almost certainly going to use that to make more moves. I think they're going to continue to buy in on guys who can play off of Ja to continue to empower him offensively, and on guys who can improve their defense as well. A type of archetype that you could look for is maybe just a solid two-way wing, who can play off of Ja, who can play without Ja. That's the kind of guy that I think the Grizzlies should be targeting here, at least from my perspective, looking at it from a coaching angle, maybe like a Jonathan Kuminga. I know that's maybe a weird take, but I can see that working. But yeah, I don't have anything left to say about the Grizzlies. It's just hard to say anything until we see what else they do. And that's all I've got for this one. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Remember to like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. I'm going to continue to be making content throughout the rest of the NBA Finals and into the off season. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.